Welcome to The Volley, a podcast by tennis majors, bringing you in-depth insights into tennis's latest hot topics from the tennis majors team.
I'm Chris Oddo, and I'm happy to welcome Simon Cambers to the latest edition of The Volley, the new podcast from Tennis Majors, which is the ultimate one-stop shop for all tennis fans, with all the latest videos, news, interviews, features, debates, and everything you could want to keep you up to date with the tennis world. Today we're going to talk about Novak Djokovic's latest tremendous achievement. On Saturday in Paris, the 20-time major champion made tennis history by locking up the ATP's year-end number one ranking for a record 7th time. Djokovic passes his idol Pete Sampras on the list and moves two clear of his peers, Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal, who each have 5. The world number one then completed his mission on Sunday, defeating Djokovic Medvedev for his 6th Paris title and a record 37th Masters 1000 crown. We're going to chat with Simon about the importance of Novak's latest achievement, where it ranks among the many milestones he's achieved over the years, and, of course, how many more times he may be able to finish a season as the world number one. So a warm welcome to Simon Cambers, an integral part of the Tennis Majors editorial team who has been covering the ATP and WTA tours for 25 years. He's worked for numerous publications, including The Guardian, The London Times, Reuters, New York Times, and ESPN.com. He's also been the co-president of ITWA, the International Tennis Writers Association, since 2019. Simon, huge pleasure to speak with you today. How are you on this fine Sunday?
I'm very well, thanks, yeah. Having enjoyed a very interesting Paris Masters.
Yes, it was excellent. And how about that final today? It was quite brilliant affair, actually. Maybe clear proof that Novak Djokovic is still very much a man on a mission at this stage of his season. Before we dive deeper into some of the far-reaching implications of Novak's week in Paris, how about your thoughts on today's final with Djokovic Medvedev?
Yeah, it was pretty spectacular from start to finish, really, wasn't it? I thought Medvedev started really well, really confidently, looked like he had a game plan, and the belief that he'd carried over from the US Open was sort of carrying through his game, running through his veins, if you like. But I just thought it was interesting the way Djokovic sort of kept himself together. He didn't seem, all week really, he's been pretty unflappable and not getting too annoyed about anything. And I think he just kept his cool, began to get in that typical Djokovic lockdown, no miss kind of style. And, from then on it was a pretty spectacular contest. The way that the rallies from the baseline were nuts, the depth they were both providing, the attacking intent, the way that Djokovic served and volleyed more than I've seen him maybe ever, was very impressive. And it's a good tactic against Medvedev. We can talk about that later. I just think it was sort of two men pretty close to the top of their games, playing on a court where it's pretty hard to hit through and hit winners. So the rallies went on forever, but it was an intriguing contest, and Djokovic just didn't want to be beaten and refused to lose.
It certainly was a very good-spirited affair. I like the energy of the match. I like the way these two are competing against one another these days. Their 10th meeting now. Djokovic leads the head-to-head 6-4. I wonder what you think of this growing rivalry between Djokovic and Medvedev. Of course, they've met twice at the Grand Slams this year, splitting those two, so a momentous victory for Medvedev, of course, at the US Open. But what are your thoughts on the rivalry and where it might be headed in the future?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's really easy to get carried away, and as soon as you see two players having a few matches in a row that are really good and really interesting and big matches, important matches like Grand Slam finals, you can start thinking this is the future. You've got to remember that Djokovic, even though he's Novak Djokovic, he is 34. He is coming to the end of his career, more closer to it than the beginning. Medvedev probably at his peak, maybe 1 or 2 years away from his very peak. So, but it's interesting just to see somebody feel like they can take on Djokovic at his own game. And we talked for a long time about how Djokovic against Medvedev is like watching a mirror. It's like, seeing Djokovic a few years ago trying to play himself. And Medvedev is a sort of taller, bigger version of Novak. And that's a huge compliment to Novak, that somebody has come along and believes that they can beat him at his own game, the game that's won 20 Grand Slams, 86 titles, 37 Masters, thousands. It's amazing. But I think Medvedev has the belief, he has the game, he has the longevity, he has the fitness, he has the big serve, which will really help him on the faster courts to create a rivalry. And he certainly pushed himself ahead of the pack in terms of consistency at the very top level in the biggest events.
Yeah, pushed himself ahead of the pack, meaning the Zverevs and the Tsitsipas's and the Rublevs of the world really don't seem to match up with Djokovic at his peak on these stages.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could, there's an argument that Tsitsipas and Zverev have had their moments on the biggest stages. I think Rublev is still a stage below them when it comes to the Grand Slams. And certainly when he plays fellow Russians, Rublev has a bit of a nightmare, has a meltdown sometimes. But I think, Medvedev, his consistency in all tournaments, but especially in the Grand Slams nowadays, and he also seems to have figured out how to play on clay as well, which will help him. I think he's put himself ahead of his peers, and he has got 10 years on Novak in age terms, and he will believe that he can turn it round. It's not going to be easy because Djokovic has still got a lot to play for, but I think he certainly put himself. He is the number 2. He was the only one who could get to number 1, and he's right there.
And what do you think of Djokovic's ability to return to the court after what was surely a heartbreaking defeat at the U.S. Open in September and perform so well in his first outing in about 2 months?
Well, it's just not a surprise anymore, is it? Anything that Djokovic does is not a surprise. As much as on paper it would have seemed like a really difficult thing, he could have just skipped the rest of the year. No one would have thought any worse of him for doing it. The heartbreak, as you said, for not quite finishing the calendar year Grand Slam. Must have been difficult to cope with, but I think, as he said in his post-match press conference after the final with Medvedev,
I was glad it was over, because the build-up for this tournament and everything that mentally, emotionally I had to deal with throughout the tournament in the last couple of weeks was just a lot. That was a lot to handle, and I was just glad that finally the run is over.
He said it's a huge relief for me that was over. That took an enormous amount out of him. So he needed a bit of time, but he's bounced back so many times in his life, even within matches. I mean, this is what he's famous for, isn't it? For in adversity, finding his best tennis. And yeah, it wasn't a surprise. I didn't think he was very good early on in the tournament, but as it went on, he just looked like he was on a mission.
Yeah, comeback kid once again, coming back from a set down against Hurkacz and then again in today's final. And I guess he was playing like a man on a mission because there was a mission, and that was to lock up the year-end number 1 ranking, which he successfully did for a record 7th time. This is a pretty remarkable achievement and celebrated across the tennis world. What do you make of it, Simon?
Yeah, it's amazing. I remember being in Hanover in 1998 for when Pete Sampras finished his 6th year in a row at number 1, and it almost destroyed Sampras trying to get there for that. He worked his butt off trying to finish those last few tournaments indoors to get the points he needed to finish number 1 again. And you think for Djokovic to do it 7 times in an era when Federer and Nadal have also been winning Grand Slams all over the place and finishing the year number 1 several times, is absolutely amazing. Its consistency, its belief, its desire, pure ability, and just the mental strength to keep going and to want to be there at the top and to keep these younger rivals in their place. It's amazing. Even in a year like this one, where he said he was just really focusing on the Grand Slams, that was good enough, wasn't it? Because he won 3 of them and he got to the final of the other one. That will get you all the points you need. I think he's an amazing individual who is driven by trying to achieve goals, and he sets these goals for himself, and he achieves them.
You took me, Simon, on a nice walk down memory lane with your piece at tennismajors.com. 7 glorious years, Novak Djokovic as the year-end number 1. Got to look back at really some truly remarkable seasons that Djokovic has had, and this is the 10-year anniversary of his first year finishing a season at number one, which was 2011, which was an utterly remarkable season that started with 41 consecutive wins and a 43-match winning streak. What have we learned about Novak throughout these remarkable seasons, and how does he compare to the other members of the big three? We know the stats are there that Federer and Nadal have only been able to finish year at number one 5 times. Is this meaningful at all?
Yeah, it's meaningful. It's definitely meaningful for Djokovic. I think he wants to hold all records. Looking at what he said after the match with Medvedev in Paris, he mentioned that he is driven by, or he when his career's finished, he wants to have all the records that he possibly could. And
I can't really fully devote myself to thinking about the historic achievements, but of course it means the world to me to be in this position, because that's obviously one of the biggest motivations of why I still play professional tennis.
That would be amazing if that's the case. He's already achieved so many of them. I think, when you look back at it's 10 years since, the longevity is the amazing thing. 2011, when he ripped things up and he was unbeaten until the French Open semi-finals, it felt like he'd sort of come of age then and sort of set himself at the top of the game. And I remember thinking at the time, how does Nadal beat him? Because he lost, I think he lost in 7 finals against him in a row. And, it's easy to get carried away when things like that are happening and you think, oh, this can never change. And things do change, of course. And Nadal was number one 2 years later. But, the way he kept coming back to it each year, in between, even if he had a year where he was outplayed by someone else, he would find a way to improve and get better. And that's what these great champions do.
It's, I wonder if you had a vision back then. I mean, you've been around a long time and seen a lot of remarkable players come and go. I mean, in the best way. You've been a player on the scene for 25 years covering the tours. Did you have any idea in 2011 when Djokovic had that season that we might be looking back 10 years from ahead, and that he'd have 7 year and number ones, he'd have 20 Grand Slams, he'd be possibly the greatest player of all time, even above Federer and Nadal?
No, not really. I mean, you knew that you were watching someone special, because he was able to beat them at their peak in the biggest events in that year. But to think that you could go from that point, I mean, in 2011, the start of 2011, he'd only won 1 Grand Slam, and that was in 2008 against Jo-Wilfried Tsonga when he won one young. You could say that he got a little bit lucky to play someone who wasn't a Federer or a Nadal or, somebody at the top of a real legend of the sport, as great a player as Tsonga was. But he won it. But it still took him another 3 years to win another one. So you wondered whether he really had what it took. And in those intervening years, there was all sorts of talk about, he had his sinus problems, he had health issues. He wasn't quite able to, he quit in a lot of matches, and people were asking, does he really have what it takes to be a top player? But I mean, he put it straight in the course of that year. I mean, it really started with the Davis Cup final of the year before. I think, he will talk about that now if you ask him. That win, that gave him the belief he needed to start winning the biggest titles against his biggest rivals. But I don't think anyone really foresaw at that time just how great a player he would become.
And there's a lot of talk about GOAT. We just touched on it, you and I together. Greatest of all time, Federer, Djokovic, Nadal. Is this achievement, this 7th year and number one finish for Djokovic, another feather in his cap when it comes to the debate?
Yep, it has to be. I mean, each of the players you mentioned, their fans will bring up something that will boost their own chances of being considered the GOAT. And you can think of it in pure stats terms, in wins terms. You could think of it in the impact on the game and the sport in general. There are all sorts of ways to look at it. But Djokovic is continually racking up the statistical victories in his favour. I mean, you look at weeks at number one, you look at 7 year-end number one rankings, you look at his head-to-head rivalry against Federer and Nadal. Unless that changes in the next couple of years, and it seems unlikely, he will end up with a positive win-loss record against those two. So there are an awful lot of reasons why he may be considered the greatest of all time. And I just think that's amazing when when you think what Federer achieved when he first came through and was, I think he reached 18 of 19 Grand Slam finals in a row, and what Rafael Nadal's done too, and Nadal, of course, still going strong. Federer hopefully playing along next year. But yeah, it's just a remarkable effort to start knocking off all these records. No one thought he would get to 20, but he's got to 20. People now assume he's going to get further. He's got 345 weeks at number one. He's going to go further. It's just amazing.
I wanted to ask you, Simon, along the lines of the same subject, but the year-end number one ranking. I don't know if the casual tennis fans really have an understanding of what it means. So what would you say is the true meaning, and why is this a valued statistic in tennis?
Well, it's a bit like, I mean, people who follow tennis would know that getting to number one is a really impressive achievement. It takes an awful lot of effort, of course. But you'll always hear from players that staying number one is harder than being number one because the way the ranking system works, because dealing with the pressure and the stress of being number one and everyone trying to take you down is difficult. And I think the same thing applies to being number one and then finishing the year number one. When you finish the year number one, it's a real statement that you have been the most consistent player over a 52-week period. You are top of the tree. It's very hard to argue that anyone was better than you in that year. The ITF award a title called the world champion, to the world champion player of that year, and it usually goes to the number one. It's a mark of consistency, and because of the way the ranking system works, that usually refers to how you've done in the Grand Slam tournaments, and the two things go hand in hand.
And the players really seem to value it. As you mentioned at the beginning of our interview, Pete Sampras, what he went through to get that sixth year to finish number one. I mean, this is something that's very important to them, and probably the reason why Djokovic is back at peak form in November of this season.
Yeah, I think if you look on the women's side, for example, Caroline Wozniacki was number one in the world at the end of the year 2 years in a row. I think 2010-11 or 11-12, one of those two. And Leighton Hewitt was number one in the world twice in a row. You know, those guys will consider that as a real feather in their cap, a real achievement, because it's maybe not as good as winning a Wimbledon or whatever, but it comes with the territory. You know, it just shows that they've been the man to beat or the woman to beat for that time, and they've been the top of the tree.
I was going to say, statistically, I looked through, there are only 17 players that have ever finished the season number one, and only 10 of those have done it more than once. So it's a very, very select group.
Yeah, it's a really elite group. It's like, I mean, it's, you know, more people have obviously won Grand Slam titles than that, and you think of the what it takes to go through a year, winning so many matches, constantly being under pressure, not having injuries, and it's not luck that these guys have managed to stay largely injury-free for most of their careers. I mean, I'm sure Nadal might argue otherwise, but in terms of how many he's had. But Djokovic, really the only bad injury he's had has been that elbow injury in 2017-18. Otherwise, he's been phenomenal. Federer, too, until recently, not had any injuries other than a sort of back issue until the last few years with his knees. So these guys are amazing at staying consistent and staying fit, staying healthy and staying motivated and staying mentally strong. I think that's the biggest issue for me, is that, you know, you could easily, once you've achieved some of these great things, you could easily just say, I've done it. But they just keep going. Another
example of working hard to finish a season number one would be Andy Murray in 2016. I mean, what he went through to get that done, and really what it cost him quite a bit. I think in retrospect we would say.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to see what he would think of that. I mean, from after, well, he won Wimbledon. From Wimbledon onwards, he basically barely lost a match in that year, and he won, I can't remember how many tournaments it was in a row that he won, and he ended up winning the last match of the ATP finals, beating Djokovic in the final to get to number one. He almost killed himself. I mean, it was really it became obvious in 2017 at the French Open when his hip injury started to come through, but you know, I'm sure it was there in the making, in all that effort that it took to get to number one. He was so desperate to do it, and he did it, and it's an enormous achievement.
And circling back to Mr. Novak Djokovic, what would you say the chances are, Simon, that he's battling and maybe locking up an eighth year in number one at this time next year?
Yeah, pretty good.
Yep.
And we're talking about a phenomenon here. I would say, it depends how he sets his schedule for the year. He will probably set it around Grand Slams again. He wants to get that record, go clear of 20 ahead of Federer and Nadal, and then open up a gap that can't be shut. It's going to be interesting because I think he'll be threatened in more places than he has been in the past. It's been coming in the last couple of years, but on clay, Tsitsipas will be a danger. On hard courts, Zverev and Medvedev will be tough. On grass, there are others who are starting to come through too. Hurkacz is playing well. Shapovalov has all the talent in the world. There's Nadal on clay, who is going to be coming back with a vengeance, desperate to win Roland Garros again. So there'll be people trying to stop him, but I think he's got a pretty good chance of getting there.
Seems that way. I think Medvedev may be emerging as his biggest rival on surfaces other than clay courts. I would say would be an interesting narrative to follow next year as well.
Yeah, but it was interesting watching Medvedev at Roland Garros this year, wasn't it? He seems to have figured out a way to get it done, depending on what the conditions are. And now I would say it's amazing how fast tennis changes. I would say in the space of 6 months, Medvedev would consider himself to be a totally different player than he was even in the middle of the year. So, with that US Open title in the bag, his confidence is going to be enormous. He's going to be a major threat.
You mentioned Djokovic's longevity quite a few times in this interview, and I also wanted to mention, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, that he's the oldest year-end number one in history this year. At 34 years old, he's only played 11 events so far this year, so clearly he's kind of in this next phase of his career where he'll be thinking more about preservation, I think, more than ever before. It really seems like he's set up to have a couple more really solid years to kind of, like, as you said, open the gap, maybe Grand Slam titles, Masters 1000 titles, year-end number ones. Do you think it's going to be a brilliant bounty of titles for Djokovic in the years ahead?
Well, it's hard to be sure because, an injury could come along and really sort of knock him off the rails. But most of it comes down to motivation. I think if he remains as motivated as he has been, then he will start 2022 as the man to beat, the top of the pile. There's still no one has really found a way yet to get the better of him regularly. So until they do that, until there's a psychological edge amongst his rivals in their favour, then he's going to believe that when it comes down to it, in a best of 5 match or 7 best of 5 matches, he is still absolutely unstoppable. And look at his record in Australia. If he goes to Australia, he will be going for a 10th title there, which is unbelievable. So yeah, he's got a great chance. I think I'd be really interested to know. No one's asked him yet. I think it would be a good question to ask him when he's next available. Is whether he thinks Jimmy Connor's record of 109 titles is possible.
Yes, that's the one that's on the list. That's pretty far away for him right now. I think he's 23 shy at the moment.
Yeah, but he won his 86th today. So yeah, 23. And if you look at his last 6 years, he's won 4, 5, 4, 2, and 7 in 2016 titles. So it really would take him, at least on that basis, at least 5 years. It's asking an awful lot. I think we thought Federer was going to get there, but it's easy to get stuck. But I imagine that might be a goal. Once he's got 21 and more Grand Slams, I imagine that might be something that would spur him on for a bit longer. But you never know, because he's got a family. He loves his family. He loves his kids. He might want to spend more time with them. You just don't know.
You might want to leave that record to Jimmy Connors.
Yeah, Jimmy Connors would definitely want him to leave that record to Jimmy Connors.
An interesting thing I was thinking of over the weekend as Novak was wrapping up his achievement is that Steffi Graf actually finished 8 seasons as the WTA's number 1. And Martina Navratilova finished 7 seasons as the WTA's number 1. I wonder, how would you, Simon, compare the men and the women in this category? And is it even relevant to compare across the tours?
Well, I think it's fun to compare across the tours, isn't it? If you think of Graf when she was being number one. She did it in the time, sort of the end of Navratilova and Graf, and then into Monica Seles, etc. So she had some seriously good players up against her. I think it's impossible to compare completely, but it's really interesting, and there's no question that finishing number one on either side, men or women, is equally impressive. Look at the strength and depth these days on the women's game. How many people are capable of winning Grand Slams to actually come out on top each year? It's why you're seeing different players do it so often. It's just not easy. It's what makes Djokovic's achievements in the era of Nadal and Federer even greater.
Mm-hmm. And then speaking of Nadal and Federer, there's a question I wanted to circle back to. Why do you think Nadal and Federer end up with less year-end number ones than Djokovic?
Well, I think in Nadal's case, you could probably put it down to there were a few years where he didn't play that much after the US Open. I mean, he had injuries, he cut short seasons occasionally. He arrived in London for the finals, the ATP finals, pretty shot. And for Federer, I don't know. I mean, five for both is pretty good, of course. It's not bad.
Absolutely.
But it's just, I think probably as they matured, they started being a little pickier with their schedules, the way Djokovic has started to be more recently. And so if you do that, you've basically got to win everything to be number one. So I think that might explain some of it. I think, finishing the year number one 5 times is pretty amazing. It's just that Djokovic has done it 7 times, which makes it look not quite so amazing.
When I did that yesterday, I just kind of felt more relaxed today. Even though there is always a pressure playing against number 2 of the world and probably my biggest rival in tennis at the moment in this season, and I wanted to finish the tournament with a trophy. There is no doubt about it.
Djokovic is called Medvedev his greatest competitor at the moment. Do you think he's overlooking Nadal, or does he really believe that Medvedev's status is that much elevated?
Well, maybe he means week in, week out, or maybe he's just being nice. I saw that those two practiced together at the Mouratoglou Academy before the Paris Masters. I saw Cedric from Tennis Majors wrote about that, of course, and it's and that I also found interesting, because I wonder what Novak's doing there, whether he's trying to keep Medvedev sort of to stop Medvedev from being ruthless with him by making him friendly and practicing with him. And I know that you can be as nice as you like, but tennis players are pretty ruthless underneath it all, especially the top ones, and they've usually got a reason for doing things like that. So I would be fascinated to know if that's what Novak's up to, even if it's subconsciously. I think Medvedev would be a week in, week out competitor, probably the most consistent competitor on hard courts, but you're not telling me that Nadal's not his biggest rival on clay. I mean, he is still going to be there. If he's fully fit next year, I think we would expect Nadal to be bouncing back and hugely motivated to try and win some more titles.
Yes. And Simon, you hit on it at the beginning of the program. The fact that Novak Djokovic came to net 36 times today, you mentioned it on Twitter during the final. He's serving and volleying quite a bit. This new wrinkle, it was very cool to see, for one, very entertaining to watch Djokovic play that style. But what does it say about Djokovic and his ability to adapt? And do you think that he'll use more of this against Medvedev, or Medvedev will maybe figure out a way to counter it?
Yeah, I think it was very smart play, and whether it came from him or premeditated, I'm sure he and Goran Ivanisevic and his coaching team Marian Vida, etc., did a good job. They know what Medvedev's about. They know the way Medvedev plays. If you in pure tennis tactics terms, if you play against someone who stands miles back on return, serve and volley is a very good tactic, because they've got so much further to hit the ball. You've got more time to get there. It's a good idea. So they obviously worked that out. But for him to be able to use it and to really step it up from the beginning of the second set onwards was impressive. I don't think he would always do it, but he'll do it when he feels like he needs to. It's just another addition to all the tools that Djokovic has in the box. And I think it's something that Medvedev should learn from, and maybe didn't learn from in that final. He should be able to stand tighter to the baseline to return serve. There's no actual need for him to return from as far back as he does. Obviously, he's made a good career out of that so far. And we've seen Nadal do that, and Dominic Thiem, etc., and others follow suit. And we know the reasons, the trajectory, what you can do. You can just hit the ball flat out. But I think it's great to see that someone breaks it up with serve and volley, because it makes them realise that, they haven't hit on an absolute winning formula. They've got to think about their own game as well. So, yeah, it'll give Medvedev something to think about next time they play, no question.
Yeah, quite impressed by how well Djokovic executed the volley. It's one thing to come in, make a nice approach, but I thought he displayed some great touch for a style of play that he really doesn't do that often.
Yeah, it's true. He probably doesn't practice it that often. He's decent in the net. He's always been good at the net. I think what I like about this is when you find a player who doesn't serve and volley that much, or doesn't go to the net that often, what often happens is when they miss one or two, they get frustrated and they just retreat back into their shell and do what they're used to. But he didn't do that. He didn't let it affect him. He didn't get bothered by it. He knew it was a good tactic, and he kept on doing it.
And finally, Simon, last question for you. I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts on how what we saw in Paris will set us up for the first ATP finals ever to happen in Turin.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think a lot will depend on what the conditions are like in Turin. I haven't heard what speed the surface will be. There's a lot of talk this week of how slow Bercy was, and also to do with how heavy and fluffy the balls got. So if it's a little bit faster, that would favour Medvedev, I would say. But in terms of where you're arriving in terms of psychology at this stage of the year, I think Djokovic still has the edge. But there are a lot of reasons to think that Medvedev will dig deep and try and find a way forward. And you look at people like Zverev, who's played very well in the last 4 or 5 months. Tsitsipas carrying an injury. Rublev maybe not quite there yet. Others who are threatening to do well. Ruud, I'm looking forward to seeing Casper Ruud on a big stage in a big tournament against top players in every single match. See how he gets on. But it's still Novak's to win or lose.
Lovely, Simon. You've done a beautiful job talking us through some of these wonderful storylines with Novak Djokovic. Appreciate all your hard work, and let's do it again soon.
Thank you, Chris. Pleasure.
You've been listening to Simon Cambers on the Volley Podcast. Make sure you check out his work on tennismajors.com, and make sure to add this podcast to your list of favorites. We're available on Spotify and all the main media platforms, and your support means a lot. Thanks for listening, and we'll chat to you soon.